Hi, I'm Mark Dresner, and this is Partnerships TV coming to you from the 2011 Partnerships in Clinical Trials Conference in Phoenix, Arizona. Joining me today is John Oidtman. He is Vice President of Clinical Operations at Pfizer. Welcome to the program, John.
Thank you, Mark.
Let's start with a few thoughts on trends. I know you have some strong ones because we spoke earlier. How about capturing the and underserved patient in, let's say, emerging markets, quality management?
Sure.
Any of these areas.
Sure, great, yeah. So, you probably are well aware that the pharma industry is facing patent cliffs.
Yes.
So we have a lot of challenges with revenue streams in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that you're seeing from pharma companies is how do we bring our products, either new products or existing products, to a broader patient population?
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about trends, I look at how do we actually stimulate clinical research in emerging markets.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can look at that in lots of different ways. And the way we've approached it is we're really trying to target the right countries. So you can target the globe and maybe be successful, but if you target specific countries where you want to stimulate research, where you want to stimulate the clinical trial process,
Mm-hmm.
build the infrastructure, I believe you'll be much, much more successful. So some of the things that we're doing internally,
Mm-hmm.
so we're looking at how do we build a better infrastructure in countries. So some of the specifics around that
Yeah.
are things like ethical research, understanding clinical trials, both at the investigator level and at the patient level. So we're actually implementing processes often with, for example, the Stephen Biko Center for Bioethics,
Mm-hmm.
where in Africa, where we're actually partnering with them to bring a broader understanding to investigators that want to participate in clinical trials on the process, understanding GCP, understanding ethics, understanding how to run a protocol, because many of them actually don't know how to do that because they haven't been experienced. And so we're doing things like that to build infrastructure, and that infrastructure will allow us to conduct better trials.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, excellent. This is kind of along the same lines. First of all, why go to these various countries?
Mm-hmm.
You're targeting them for...
Yeah, so that's a great question. So if I look at it, again, I started, I think, the conversation with the patent cliff.
Right.
So how do you soften that? How do you soften that patent cliff so it's not such a dramatic drop-off of revenue? So one of the ways is you can get your existing products to, for example, China, where if you look at China, there's about 120 cities that have 1 million people or more.
Mm-hmm.
So just bringing a sales force with your existing products will bring more revenue potential to your country,
Mm-hmm.
or to your company and the country that you're working in. So those are some of the things of why we want to do that. Now, how does clinical research fit into that equation?
Yeah.
Because I was talking about sales.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at if you were the head of a country, the head of Pfizer China or the head of BMS India,
Uh-huh.
you're thinking about how do I stimulate prescribers to use my medications.
Right.
So one of the ways you do that is by having them understand your products through clinical research. And so again, the reason of why is because we're trying to stimulate revenue, yes, and we're trying to actually educate investigators on how to operate effectively under GCPs and conduct clinical trials. Because the real goal for us is we want to bring new molecules that are targeted for populations in the emerging markets,
Mm-hmm.
so that we can actually stimulate more healthy populations.
Yeah. I'm
Go
sorry
ahead,
to
please.
interrupt. You're looking at clinical research almost as a marketing tool, if you will. And I don't mean that in a crass way. I think it's terrific. It's
So I would say
or
it's
an educational tool.
I would say it's more of an innovation. It's
Mhm.
an engine of innovation.
Okay.
So we actually have internal to our company, we have this engine of sustainable innovation. It's kind of
Right.
our drive for the near term. And one of the things that we look at is how do we stimulate research, innovation in countries that we haven't typically worked in. And so I look at clinical research as one facet in trying to stimulate really innovation in the emerging markets also.
How about incenting the teams that you're going to be working with in those markets?
That's a very, very difficult, that is a very tough question and a very difficult piece to change. Because
Yeah.
what you're talking about is, how do I change culture? It was interesting today in the the IIR presentations, we saw some data from Avoca
Yeah.
around perceptions of quality in emerging markets and developed markets, and there was very dramatic drop off once you got out of North America, Western Europe, Eastern Europe. Then you started seeing a marked drop off of people's belief that quality research is being done. So having said all that, how do you then incent a team to go there?
Yeah.
So what we've been trying to do is we've been trying to set some really goals for both at the corporate level. So how do we want to actually operate as a company? And then how do we incent the decision makers on clinical trials? The clinician that's actually writing that protocol. Don't have that nut cracked. Guarantee we don't have that nut cracked, because a lot of it's around culture.
Sure.
So we're starting with education. We're starting with educating our teams on the opportunity that exists, what our quality data tells us, and where the key sites are where they can run trials that fit their portfolio. So that's a lot of what we're doing internally to try to change the culture and incentivize teams to actually do more trials in emerging
It
markets.
makes terrific sense. Let me ask you a question. When you're looking at emerging markets, for example, since we're on that, I suppose that perception versus reality. That in the Avoca data, I don't know how much of that is reality, how much of it is perception. But what keeps you up at night when you're looking at these issues?
So what keeps me up at night is really how quickly we find quality issues. So as a company, we aren't really quick. That sounds so negative, but I wish we were quicker. That's a better way of putting it, in a positive tone, in actually knowing when things were going awry at an investigator site. So if you look at the internet, a great example. The internet has created an electronic environment that is accessible to the globe, and everyone's using it, whether it be on mobile devices, whether it be in computers or whatever. That has stimulated a kind of almost a view that I want instantaneous gratification. I don't have that instantaneous gratification in clinical research. I actually require an investigator to enter data, that data to be checked, and then medical monitors review that data. So it's a process that can take weeks before I know something's going on. I would love for that to be instantaneous.
You're looking for those triggers that we discussed earlier.
Yeah, and in fact, there's an industry that's doing this extraordinarily well already, and it's the credit card industry. And so I'll tell you a personal story. Last year, I was sitting at home, and I get a call from Discover, my credit card company, and they asked me, I was sitting in Connecticut, they asked me, were you making a purchase in, I think it was Boca Raton, Florida, at 1 o'clock at Sam's Club, and then 2 o'clock at Walmart, and then 3 o'clock at another Walmart? And I was like going, no, I'm sitting in Connecticut. It's Saturday, I'm watching basketball.
That would be a trigger.
Actually, basketball wouldn't be right because I was in the wrong season, but whatever. I was watching sports. But how did they call me in 2 or 3 hours around fraudulent charges that were being made in my card, yet I can't have that same level of transparency into data in a clinical trial? That's what I would love to see happen. How? That's a challenge in itself.
That's $1 million question. But if it's being done in other industries, to your point, obviously there is a way. There is a solution out there. I'm sure that Pfizer is probably making pretty strong strides, or at least pushing.
Yeah, I would say it's probably not Pfizer. I would say it's probably more industry.
Industry-wide.
Because because if I look at industry, I think the near-term opportunity may be in what's called cloud computing. And this concept of how do we share the infrastructure is a better way of putting it. How do we not build systems internally that cost us a lot of money, but instead share the cost of those systems with other companies and have much more transparency around data, because it can be aggregated faster when it's in a shared repository. So there are companies out there that do this, and you can probably go look on the web and find some of these data aggregation companies. I won't name them, but if you search, you'll find them. But this is an area where, in the pharma industry, it's still very nascent. We haven't really developed this too well. But I know there are executives in industry that are looking at how do we leverage this type of platform infrastructure to really provide services, so that I can just go out and say I want to do data management, I would get charged for the number of data elements that get placed into a repository, for example. I don't actually have to build a data management tool.
So it's a real sea change, I think, directionally, not just the technology itself, but the mentality. Because you're going from, as you put it when we last spoke, an IBM sort of siloed type of culture to something more aligned with Salesforce.com.
Yeah. So when I was referring to the IBM, I was referring to the mainframe. So like,
right.
We're moving from mainframe, everything has to be in our walls to something that's much more flexible. And mobile technology is a great example of where you're seeing that. In fact, at Pfizer, we actually, there's a gentleman, David Leventhal, that's actually working on something called PACER, which is looking at electronic medical records. And I think that's an example of where you're looking at informatics, technology, help us in understanding the safety of our products, understanding how we can find patients more effectively, and understanding really the developing science around the trials that we're running.
One last question, John, and that is competence in vendors from an IT standpoint, platforms, ideas. Are you seeing a sufficient volume there, a sufficient quality level there, or can we step that game up? What's your position on that?
So there's probably a couple things there. I think there are companies out there that deliver very high quality services and tools, and they're probably in the audience of the program we're at today. So I don't think it's necessarily the tools. I think it's more of internal, the company like Pfizer or the company like Merck or the company like GSK. How do they actually change their culture? How do they actually take that step to really move into this paradigm where we don't have as much control? Because I think we're in a regulated industry.
Right.
Our company's currently operating under some very challenging requirements from FDA, and so in those environments you tend to want to control. So it's a matter of how do we balance that level of control with the freedom that not having those systems inside our walls would provide us.
Brave new world.
Yeah, very much.
On that note,
Aldous Huxley.
You've given us a lot to think about. These are very, very hefty issues for the industry. So on that note, I want to thank you, John, very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And that will conclude, thank you for the audience, that will conclude this episode of Partnerships Television. Please stay tuned for our upcoming episodes, and hopefully we'll see you next year at Partnerships in Clinical Trials 2012. Thanks, I'm Mark Dresner.